Today I want to talk about the weight of match rods and whether it actually matters that much. Is it the rod weighs that is important, or is it the balance of the rod, the feel of the rod, what it's like to use? And I think I will conclude at the end that the weight is just one factor. It's not the most important factor. I've dug out some old rods here, some of the rods I use, one or two that I very rarely use, but they're old favourites. And when it comes to carbon match rods, the big change with carbon that came about in the very late 70s, when carbon match rods became fairly common, quite expensive back then. A made-up rod could cost from sort of about 80 to 100 pounds. There were match rods as early in carbon as early as 1975, but by about 78, 79, tackle shops were selling them like hot cakes, really. Rods like the Sundridge Kevin Ashurst rod, 13-foot rod, about 6.5 ounces, which felt incredibly light. We were used to Bruce and Walker and Shakespeare and Abu match rods that weighed anything up to over 12 ounces in glass. And suddenly you had these rods that were barely half the weight. They were thinner. And the actions were different. They were better. People say that glass rods peaked in the mid 70s, towards the end of the 70s, and that's probably true. And development, once carbon rods came in, the development of glass rods stopped. By about 1980, no one was bothering to produce better glass rods. Some people said, oh, they got a better action. And of course, the problem with early carbon rods was that the actions were quite fierce. And initially the answer was to put in spliced tips of solid carbon fibre. One of the rods I had was that Ashurst rod, and that had a massive flat spot at the tip. I had two of these rods. I broke both of them. This was common. They were quite brittle at the time, and they were replaced free of charge, and I sold them on sometime in the early 80s. As I acquired better rods, better carbon rods. That rod weight of around about 6 to 6.5 ounces is still something you find now. And there are people who are there are a few match rods that are quite a bit lighter. But if you look at Daiwa's specification list, you'll find quite a few rods are still 6.5 ounces. We're talking 13-foot rods, just going to talk about 13-foot rods, even 7 ounces. And yet they're good rods. They're very well made, very reliable. If you make a rod a lot lighter, something has to go. You can reduce the weight of a made-up rod by a light handle, less fittings, by using eyes that are stripped back, using things like titanium, single legs. And if you go back to those early 80s rods, they were with hard chrome double leg rings. And then we started to get the early Fujis and Seimos, but they weren't single leg. So the rod felt a bit less balanced, a bit more weight down towards the tip of the rod. This was the first really good match carbon rod that I got. This is a Bruce and Walker John Dean 13-foot with a spliced tip. Very nice. I've got a second one where I've broken the tip, so I've got the bottom two joints. Apparently I could get Bruce and Walker to make me up a new tip for it, but what with postage and everything else, it'd probably be 80 or 90 pounds. I've still got this one as usable. I don't use it very often. It weighs about 6.5 ounces. The old metal rings came off years ago. I sanded down the handle. It was a little bit longer and took the metal rings off. And these are plastic rings on there with a covering of inner tubes. The handle on this rod is quite light, so when you set it up, although it's 6.5 ounces, it feels a little bit top heavy, and by the standards of the best modern rods, it feels a little bit soft. I've caught an enormous number of big roach on this rod. Some of the biggest matches I ever won were using this in the early 80s. Caught thousands of fish on it. It's a fantastic rod, just really excellent. And like I say, by today's standards, it feels a little bit archaic, but it still catches fish. But remember that weight, 6.5 ounces. And that was really state of the art, 1981, designed by John Dean. It doesn't come with a better pedigree than that. This rod is a rod that I inherited. It's a Team Daiwa X, which was top of the range in about 1997. Now I've changed the tournament handle to a standard Fuji because the tournament wasn't that comfortable, and I've put this cork hood on it. It's got an arm lock handle, but it's a slim blank. There's no splice tips, a hollow tip. Nice, very forgiving. Surprising amount of power in the middle. Certainly far better for beating really big fish than the John Dean. John Dean was way better than the glass rods, but this thing is something else. I've had carp to 23 pounds on it, and this weighs more than the John Dean. But if you look at the difference of the weight of this butt joint, this weighs about an ounce more than the John Dean butt joint. So these two sections are quite a bit lighter than the John Dean because they're slimmer. It's a better grade of carbon as time has progressed. There's been, they've developed carbon fibre. Got single leg eyes for most of the rod except the ones on the butt here. And with the arm lock as well, it feels a very light rod to use. Very, very nice rod. I use it mostly on still water. I don't use it on rivers so much, not because it's too heavy, just because I prefer to fish a waggler on it, and I've got other rods that are better for waggler fishing. Another rod, if I can pick it out of this little lot. This one's a bit older. This is a somewhat battered Normark Titan 2000. The handle's got damaged by me putting my own version of an arm lock, which I've taken off. I did take off the original Fuji fitting, put a cork with rings, which I've now removed again, and put Fuji fitting back on, re-whipped the eyes on there, and put a cork hood on it. I removed the original Normarks have this, I don't call it plastic bung on the end of the handle, and I removed that. This weighs 16 grams, so it's over half an ounce. Half an ounce is about 14 grams, so that weighs 16 grams, and it gives it a bit better balance maybe, but it's such a light rod. Again, a slim blank. I bought this in 1991, 32 years ago. This rod feels very light. It's an absolute delight to use. Brilliant for playing fish. Can't fault it. And yet it weighs, with this hood, about 6 ounces, which means there are rods that are an ounce or so lighter than that. The thing with Normarks is you have to watch the tips. This one has lost a tiny bit off the tip. I don't know how much. This has lost about 1 centimetre off the tip. And to the purists, with what I've done to the handle, it's completely worthless. It's wonderful to fish with, and I've got no intention of selling it anytime soon. It's so comfortable with this hood. Now, this hood, I've just weighed a couple of the corks. what with the glue and one thing, adds about 12 ounces to the weight of the rod. But when you think about it, it's right under your hand, which is where the reel is, and the reel is there. Mitchell match weighs something like 11 ounces. The overall weight of the rod, there's much more weight in the reel than there is in the rod. And if in an ideal world you'd have a reel that weighed 4 ounces, good luck. But a fixable reel, you can get ones sort of 7 or 8 ounces. They're a lot of money. I like my Mitchell matches, so, and I can cope with these weights, honestly. I do light weights in the gym, and I only do bicep curls on 12.5 kilos. That's an awful lot more than the few grams we're talking about here. The final rod I'm going to look at is one that I've had 7 years, a TriCast John Allerton Premier Match. And again, it's a light rod. I've changed the handle. This had a screw up handle, replaced a bit of cork there. Now got a Fuji screw down instead of what was there before. Put the hood on it. It still only weighs about 6 ounces. Nice slim blank. Solid carbon tip. Nice and tippy there. This is when I said about which rods I use on the river. This is my general light tackle stick float rod. I do use the Titan 2000 as well. That's nice on a stick float. Now it's got a handle that's good. But this one is a cracking river rod. If I'm fishing for bigger fish, I might use a Carbotech or a Avenger 2000. But this one is light and tippy, beautifully balanced. Again, there's no weight in these top joints. So the weight really is down here in the handle. No arm lock, which is a shame. This one's still obtainable. You might have to go to your tackle shop and order one. And your tackle shop can go to TriCast and get one. But a very, very nice river rod. So you might say, which considering John Dean himself uses acrylites, why don't I buy acrylites, which are so much lighter? And there are some other rods. I can't remember off the top of my head whether they're Milo or something. One or two of the Colmic rods are very light as well. These rods do everything I want. They're reasonably robust as long as I look after them better than I used to, which means putting them in rod bags, putting them in strong tubes and then in a holdall. I don't set them up at home, carrying them with a reel on and all the line wrapped round there. That is the way you damage rods. And they are just a joy to use. The acrylites, I think they're a bit fragile. People say, oh, well, everyone breaks rods. Too many have broken. I think they've gone a little bit too near the margin of error. That's my opinion. The action, not totally convinced with them. Some of these are better than others, depending on what you're fishing, whether you're fishing a waggler or a stick float or a croakquill haven. But they all work. They're lovely for playing fish, bounce very few fish. And they're what I want to use. I hope I've got you thinking as ever. And until next time, it's goodbye for now.